Thank you for joining Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development 2020. Before we begin, this is Rachel Ong, the technical host for this session, and we have a couple of virtual housekeeping announcements. To maximize the bandwidth for all participants, please switch off your videos unless you are in your breakout groups afterwards. Do mute your microphones to avoid unnecessary interruption and background noise, and close any unnecessary programs if you are experiencing slow bandwidth on your computer or laptop. Do use the public chat box to engage with one another during the session. And just a reminder that this session is being live streamed and the recording will remain public on the ERA Asia Pacific YouTube channel afterwards. We are very committed to ensuring that this is a safe, neutral, inclusive environment, and we would like to inform you that participants who engage in disruptive behavior may be removed without prior notice. We urge you to be respectful and to avoid replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. And without further ado, we will hand over to our session organizer.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Really nice to see so many of you join today's session. My name is Sophia Fangay. I am your host today, and I welcome you to this joint Global South Women's Forum event, the Audacity to Disrupt, an introduction to feminist macro level economics. And the event is co-hosted by Femnet and the Gender and Development Network, also known as GADDN. So today's session is the product of a joint publication or guide that both Femnet and GADDN produced earlier this year, interestingly also called the Audacity to Disrupt. This guide is an accompaniment to Femnet's annual African Feminist Macroeconomic Academy, or AFMA, which targets African gender activists, movement leaders, journalists, and many others working on advancing gender equality and women's rights, really to develop their understanding about how macroeconomic policies shape women's lives. So this year in 2020, AFMA was held virtually, so just last month. And so we are today relaunching that guide as part of AFMA 2020, but also as part of this week-long Global South Women's Forum convening on disrupting macroeconomics, which fits in absolutely perfectly with the key issues that are identified in that guide. So a lot of what is covered in today's session is discussed in more detail in the guide. So I actively encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. So I'm just going to pop the link in the chat box for you as well now. Great. So that you can have a read of it, not necessarily now, but at a later point at your earliest convenience. But also what I want to really critically add at this stage is this guide that is in the chat box has been informed by the collective stream of work as well as expertise of many individuals, as well as teams who've been integral in developing some of the key concepts within that guide, some of the key methodologies, as well as people who've facilitated AFMA over the recent years. And actually, I think I see you on here, Nancy, one of the people who is responsible for facilitating one of the AFMAs and for contributing to the thought production within AFMA is on this call today. So I just wanted to really reiterate how immensely thankful we are for your knowledge and expertise in providing that in the development of the guide. So I just want to move on to today's format, so what you can expect in the next hour and a half. So initially we'll have a 30-minute presentation, which will cover some of the key themes and topics on feminist macro level economics. There'll then be an opportunity for you to discuss some of these key issues raised in the presentation in breakout groups, and we have 40 minutes for that. And then we'll have a chance to hear from some of you about some of the points that were discussed in your breakout groups before we then wrap up. So I think Rachel has already covered a lot of the housekeeping points about keeping your videos off, especially if you have issues with bandwidth, and if possible, if you can mute yourself as well during this initial presentation. But certainly once we get to the breakout groups, feel free to turn on your cameras, introduce yourselves, and of course, certainly chat amongst each other. So I want to share with you, first and foremost, my screen with today's presentation. So let's move on to the next screen here. So what are we going to cover in today's session? So, so a key thing to make sure is what we'd like to discuss today is getting you to understand what macro level economics is and what feminist macro level economics is and why it's a women's rights issue, largely because a lot of times it's been separated and not been considered a women's rights concern. But also today, what we want to be able to discuss is who makes decisions about our economy, how it works, and where are those decisions made and how are those decisions made. But there'll also be an opportunity for you to discuss and learn more about our current global economy, how we've got to the place that we are now. But also, critically, what I want to also be able to discuss, given the key themes of the Global South Women's Forum, is how feminist macro level economics can aid in the redistribution of resources from the global North to the global South. Okay, so first things first, what I'd like for us to do to really kind of kickstart us, and especially if it's really early for you in the morning or really late for you wherever you are, I want to start off with a poll. So the question I want to ask is this: what 3 words would you use to describe our global economy? So I'm going to put in the chat box the link for you to insert your comments. So I hope you can all see that. So I'm going to give you 1 minute to go and click onto that link and type in 3 words that you would use to describe our global economy. And then I'm going to share that with everyone else in a second. So please go ahead. Okay, 30 more seconds. If you can use 3, great. If not, you know, even 1 would just be really helpful and great. Okay, perfect. I can see some of you typing in the chat box as well, which is really great. So let me share my screen with you so that you can see some of the results that have come up. Okay, I hope you can all see that. And people are still typing, please go ahead. So some of the key words that you've used to describe it are unequal, which a lot of you have used, unsustainable, exploitative, unfair, patriarchal, capitalist. I mean, I feel like I don't need to do this session at all. I think many of you are very well versed in how our current global economy operates, how it functions. And these are exactly the kind of words that I would also myself use to describe the current state of affairs with our global economy. So that's, I think, a very good, accurate depiction of where things stand as it stands. So let's go back to the presentation. And let me share my screen with you again. Okay, great. I hope you can see my screen still. Okay, so as you can see, the key thing that the next key issue that I think we need to talk about, considering that now we've identified that the global economy is extremely unjust, exploitative, extractive, and so on. I think what we'll get into in a little bit more, and which many of you might already be familiar with, is how the economy is not just automatically like this. It is done so by design. It is not just a fault of nature, but it has been crafted to work in this extremely exploitative, extractive way that really only benefits a very, very certain group of people at the expense of a lot of others. So we come on to this question of what is macro level economics? And I think it's really important to say that there's this assumption constantly that macro level economics is super technical, it's very, very complicated, and really should be left to old rich white men to figure out how it works. And clearly this is not the case. So put really, really simply, macro level economics is the study of the economy as a whole on a national or international level. And most importantly, it's how governments make decisions about how to raise and spend their money, which ends up having a really big impact on the everyday lives of people living on the margins, and especially women and girls. So it's a really important way, I would say, for governments to plan how they will resource the rights of all their residents. But critically, and really, 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 really importantly, macro level economic decision making is about political choices, because the decisions about where to allocate resources, where to spend money, is not done without some thought and further consideration, and political decisions are made about how those resources should be spent. So if we move on to the next slide, about why this is a women's rights issue, I think a lot of you will in some way, shape or form work in or are interested in issues around women's rights at the moment. And perhaps, if you're tuning in from Argentina right now, it might be, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the morning for you, but perhaps you are. Let's say, for example, you've been campaigning for women's universal rights and access to abortion services. Or perhaps if you're located in Namibia and you're on this call today and you've been part of the Shut It Down movement in Namibia that's been protesting about violence against women and girls, or even if you've been following the likes of Malala Yousafzai about the need to provide girls with education. So all of these issues, whether that be sexual reproductive health and rights, violence against women and girls' education, at the core, of course, they're all women and girls' rights issues, but at the core, what unifies them is the need for them to be resourced. They require money in order for those issues to be properly realized. So if in any way, shape or form, if you identify as a feminist or women's rights activist, and if you've been involved in demanding increased government resources for women's rights, like these issues that I've just mentioned, or there could be plenty of others, in some way, shape or form, you have already been involved in some level of macro level economic policy work, as well as the gendered impacts of the current macroeconomic model. So I would almost warmly congratulate you and tell you that you're all budding feminist economists. So the key thing to remember here is that it is not something that is super technical. It's something that affects the everyday lives of you and I, as well as every single person, macro level economic decision making. But for the longest time, it's been deemed to be the reserve of a very, very small handful of people. So as we've seen, and as I mentioned before, decisions about which areas governments spend money on is really a political one. And it's made largely by those who have money and power. Which is why we see in a lot of countries, governments spending huge amounts of money on military, on policing, repaying debts. Yet there is often very little or no money provided for critical services like social protection, like healthcare, like childcare, like social care, And I think, many of you will have seen that in how your governments have responded to COVID-19, which has really been a real clear way to indicate and show the priorities that governments have as it relates to what they spend their money on. So if we move on to the next slide about understanding our current economy. So I won't go into a huge amount of depth into this, and certainly there have been loads and loads and loads of brilliant feminist economists, certainly those located in the global south, who have written extensively about how our current global economy has been designed, and especially the colonial legacy that still defines it. But I think it's really important to say at this stage that we have colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and certainly white supremacy have all been really critical in shaping parts of our economy. So if you think about issues like the distribution of wealth, if you think of our modern day financial instruments that we use, as well as some of the key ideas about how we about how we think about poor and marginalized communities, particularly from the global south, all of these are a product of colonialism and white supremacy. So to take you on a very, very short tour of the transatlantic slave trade and colonization. So we know that over a period of 400 years, European powers conquered and carved up large parts of the globe as a way to enhance their financial and global influence. I live here in London, which I joyfully call the heart of empire, and the British Empire at one point ruled over a quarter of the world. It's incredible to think of it now, but of course that was a very physical kind of domination, and of course those structures still remain to this day. So we know that in addition to conquering and colonizing large parts of the globe, a lot of European powers were also engaged in the systematic enslavement of Black Africans as part of the transatlantic slave trade. And all of this was done in an effort to build Europe's wealth through the sale of key commodities like sugar and cotton, etc., which were really, really in high demand. So using the unpaid and exploited labor of Black people allowed Europeans to vastly increase their profits. And all the while you have enslaved Black people who were subjected to centuries of unspeakable violence and horror. Again, a legacy which continues to this day. So you can almost see how this was the start of our modern day understanding or system of capitalism, which sees workers exploited for the sole purpose of ensuring financial profit for the upper classes. And it's also the birth of our modern day European banking systems and how we identify and what we now identify as multinational corporations, as well as the many financial instruments that we have in place. So if you think of our international tax rules, like illicit financial flows, which I'll touch in a little bit. And as I mentioned, lots and lots of brilliant authors have written about this quite extensively, which you can find, through even just a cursory search, will uncover a lot of this information. So the key thing I want you to think about is that if our current financial system evolved out of this colonial project, what reason do we have to believe that this system works for the benefit of people in the global south, particularly Black, Indigenous people of color? And the reality, as you've already highlighted and identified, is that the economy is unequal, it's unfair, it does not work for everybody. So if I move on to the next slide and try and bring us all the way up to date from 400 years of colonization all the way up to now. Critically, over the last 40 years, there's been a particular type of ideology that has dominated all aspects of our human existence, I would say, and specifically how our economies are designed. And that is this ideology called neoliberalism, which many of you will have heard of, or at least, and I know I've seen it in the Mentimeter vote that we just had. Some of you had mentioned it as well. So one of the great things about neoliberalism, how it's managed to be so apolitical, where people haven't been able to grasp the concept as a whole, is that the definition is very hard to come up with, something really concrete. But at its very essence, it's about this ideology that places the market at the center of all human interactions, and it's all largely for the critical pursuit of economic growth. And as I've put in the slides there, just a couple of ideas about so some of the features of neoliberalism, which includes the reduction of the role of the state, privatization, deregulation, suppressing workers' rights, a real focus on the individual over the collective. And these are just some of the features so that you are more conscious or more aware when you see them that these are a way in which neoliberalism presents itself. So one of the things I would argue, and many of you I'm sure will agree, is that neoliberalism has a tremendous influence over large parts of how we live. And as I mentioned before, a large part of its success is because we haven't been able to pinpoint a concrete definition. It exists in virtually every aspect of our lives. And it is driven by a very particular ideology and a very political view of the world, although it tries to pass off as apolitical. And this kind of thinking has come to dominate how some of the most powerful global institutions that are responsible for macroeconomic decision think. So it's become very, very widespread and very, very influential. And as we have seen time and time again, the key ideas behind neoliberalism simply do not work for the majority. And in fact, it has helped to exacerbate inequalities tremendously and continues to propel us really from one disaster to the other. So if you think about the 2008 global crash, the climate crisis, and even the current economic shocks that have been caused by COVID-19, all of these are a product or linked to neoliberalism. So if I move on to my next slide, this question about how can feminist ideals be realized within our current economy? And of course, we are very short on time. We could have an entire 1.5 hour discussion on this, but the answer is no, feminist ideals can't be realized within our current economy. As you've all identified, our current economy is exploitative, it's unequal, it's unjust. And without, again, going into a full-blown debate about what we mean by feminism and feminist ideals, I think generally we can agree that it refers to both an analytical tool, but also a strategy for dismantling patriarchal power, as well as all other types of power that it intersects with, let that be race, class, disability, sexual orientation, etc. So I would definitively say that feminism cannot be realized within neoliberalism because neoliberalism requires or relies on inequality and exploitation to sustain itself. And so if you think an ideology which requires and lives off the exploitation of women's unpaid care, poor Black, Indigenous, people of colors, exploited labor, which also requires our planet to move beyond its limits and requires the whole-scale destruction of whole ecosystems to survive and reach GDP targets. This arguably is not in line with the feminist approach. So neoliberalism and feminism are arguably incompatible, although you will find people who will argue differently. So what I want to do quite quickly is just delve in a little deeper into the care economy as a core part of understanding feminist macro level economics. So many of you will be familiar with this term, you've come across it before, but the care economy, or the reproductive economy, as some people call it, is the vast amounts of unpaid care and domestic work within both the household and across communities that is overwhelmingly done by women. But it also includes paid care work like childcare, social care, nursing, all within the labor force or the productive economy, which is again done overwhelmingly by women. Overwhelmingly, again, the care economy is a fundamental part of how our societies operate, how they function properly. And without it, our economies, our societies would crash and come to a complete halt. And I think many of you will have seen it in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, how the care economy has been a central part of the response. And you'll see it within your own lives, I'm sure as well, about how that has played out. However, our current neoliberal capitalist economies rely, and some might even argue, free rides on women's unpaid care burdens, which are a product of socially constructed gender roles, where we expect that women should naturally be carers, so therefore they should fill in these gaps in the household, across communities, etc. But yet no monetary value is accorded to this work at all, unpaid care that is, although, as I mentioned, it's a core part of how our capitalist economies function, as well as it's the key way in which you are guaranteeing the next generation of workers who will be part of the labor force. You have women overwhelmingly being at home, raising children in order to do that. But if this work wasn't provided for free by women, again, overwhelmingly at home, governments would have to vastly increase the amount of money that they spend on public services, or, as I mentioned before, the economy would grind to a halt. You might have come across this statistic, but by way of demonstrating how critical the reproductive economy is for the functioning of all societies, by conservative estimates, its monetary value is calculated as being approximately $10 trillion a year, or otherwise 13% of total global GDP. However, it is never truly considered or remunerated or packaged in how we understand our economies. Many governments just do not include it in their calculations. And as we know, even before COVID, women performed the lion's share of unpaid care work in the household. And of course, the pandemic has now increased that. You have child caring responsibilities, including schooling, domestic work, looking after the sick, the vulnerable, the elderly. And again, it's women who are picking up this slack. And there's this almost consistent and universal belief that women's time is completely inelastic. So women are able to fill in these gaps when the state is not able to provide those services, or where it completely doesn't acknowledge that it needs to provide these services. But this obviously has a knock-on effect on women, because it means that women aren't necessarily able to participate fully in paid work. But we also see the knock-on effect in paid care roles like nursing, teaching, which are also really poorly paid. And it really is a demonstration of how we devalue care work and devalue the care economy. And by doing so, what it does is that it continues by continuing to devalue the care economy. It means that we actually hide the real cost of social infrastructure like childcare, social care, healthcare, etc., because we're always expecting that women will step in and fill in the gaps. So I hope that's given you a really small flavor, at least, of how our economies are designed, but also, so now I think what would be helpful, especially given time, is to move on to the question of who is doing the designing of our economies. So if I move on to my next slide here, I hope you can see that. As we discussed earlier, neoliberalism has continued to and has come to dominate the thinking within some of the most powerful and influential global economic decision-making spaces in the world. It also dictates the thinking of and teaching within key academic institutions. So think of all the really big universities, the most renowned universities that you can think of, some of the biggest think tanks in the world. All of them are led by that kind of thinking, which is founded on on neoliberalism. So what I want to do is quickly highlight some of the key global institutions that shape and make global macroeconomic decisions. So if I go onto my screen here, I don't know, I wonder if you can see all that. So critically, we have here in the center or across the global north, across the Americas, you've got the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. Across here in Europe, you've got the likes of the World Economic Forum, the G7, the OECD, etc., which again continue to have a huge influence in economic decision making. Across Asia, you have institutions like the New Development Bank, as well as the leading of the G20. And if you look across larger parts of the global South, including Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, you've got the African Union and you've got the UN regional economic commissions. So I think if you take a minute to reflect on the content of this map, what can you observe about where these institutions are located geographically, and what kind of worldview are they clearly privileging? So if you see here, overwhelmingly, these institutions are dominated in the global north, very few by comparison in the global south, and those in the global south have limited influence as well by comparison to the ones that we know, the bread and butter ones that are household names. So what I want to do very, very quickly is touch on two of these institutions, in particular, the IMF and the World Bank, which are otherwise known as the Bretton Woods institutions. And as I mentioned, the Bretton Woods institutions are two of, specifically the IMF and the World Bank, are two of the institutions that we hear about a lot. They wield a lot of power and influence and have become really, really important as part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So more detail on this is in the guide, is in the pack, but there's also lots and lots of brilliant information and resources that feminists from around the world have collated about how these two institutions function, if you want some more detail about the ins and outs. But the IMF is always joyfully known as the bank of last resort. It's largely for countries who are in massive financial distress and who tend to overwhelmingly be from the global south. And with the provision of the loans that are given, there's always conditionalities attached to those loans. And a lot of them are neoliberal conditionalities, the ones that we discussed earlier on. So thinking of, suppressing labor rights, deregulation, prioritizing the private sector over the state, etc. And a lot of those conditions are built into the loan agreements that the IMF provides. But the IMF also does provide technical assistance on how to implement a lot of these neoliberal recommendations. As part of the pandemic, as I mentioned before, the IMF has been providing emergency loans to many countries in the global south. And many of these loans we are seeing, even in the midst of this pandemic, are attached to those loans are conditionalities, which are absolutely painful at a time when so many countries are trying to deal with the economic and health shocks of the pandemic. And quickly, if we move to the World Bank provides policy advice, research analysis, and technical assistance to developing countries, as well as funding very, very specific projects. So what we can see in these two institutions, and this is just a snapshot because there are many others that were identified in that map, is that there's a concentration of decision-making power in the global north. So with the IMF and the World Bank, the heads of those two institutions always have been American or European, and the global north still controls a huge amount or disproportionate amount of voting power within the World Bank and the IMF, because voting power is accorded to which countries contribute the most financially. And so even at the way things stand, even if all the countries in the global south decided that they wanted to change the way in which the IMF and World Bank vote, it would be impossible for them to do so because collectively, countries in the global south have less power or voting power than those combined in the global north, despite them being the global majority. And again, what we see with these two institutions, again and again, is the triumph, prioritization, and protection of neoliberalism. So again, privatization, deregulation, liberalization, financialization, all the izations is really what we see identified within these two institutions, despite the fact that we know that neoliberalism does not work for the majority. So, taking into consideration everything that we've discussed about, how can feminist macro level economics aid in the redistribution of resources from the global north to the global south? So it's really important to say that depending on the type of intervention that is decided, macro level economic policy can be used by governments as well as by policymakers to better the needs of those living on the margins of society, particularly women, and particularly women across the global south. And policymakers have a variety of different mechanisms and instruments at their disposal. In the guide, it's something that's referred to as the macroeconomist's toolkit, a term that's been coined by a feminist economist called Stephanie Seguino. And some of these tools can be used to redistribute resources from the global south to from the global north to the global south. And you ask, importantly, how does that happen? How does that take shape? So I just want to really, really briefly, because I know we're short on time, want to focus on two key issues, and those are taxation and debt cancellation as two of the ways in which those resources can be redirected. And again, I would say for more information generally about other types of fiscal policies and trade and investment policies, I'd encourage you to read the guide. So, really quickly on taxation or progressive taxation is one of the biggest tools, ways of being able to redistribute resources as well as reducing different types of inequalities. One of the key areas that you'll see talked about quite frequently is this issue of curbing illicit financial flows. And again, Africa, for example, alone loses about $50 billion every single year as a result of the movement of money or capital from one country, usually in the global south, to another, usually in the global north. And this money or capital can take the form of either illegal tax evasion, where corporations or high net worth individuals just simply do not pay any tax at all that's owed, or they can be done legally through tax avoidance or tax dodging, which is legal but highly socially questionable, something that we frown upon and don't see as something that is good. One of the other ways in which we can try and divert resources from the south, from the north to the south, is stopping tax incentives and tax holidays, particularly to multinational corporations. So a lot of times, and again, some of the recommendations being provided by the IMF and the World Bank as part of efforts to attract foreign investment, many governments are encouraged to provide incentives like tax breaks and sign international treaties that restrict their ability to tax multinational corporations. So a really great example in Nigeria, between 1992 and 2012, Nigeria, just as one example, lost an estimated $3.3 billion over that 10-year period as a result of a 10-year tax break that the government granted to some of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, just simply so that they could operate in Nigeria. So if you think that Nigeria's health budget last year was $127 million for a population of 200 million people. But yet over the space of 10 years, they had lost $3.3 billion. Just think of how many times over that would have been able to fund Nigeria's health service if that money had been, if those tax treaties had not been put in place. One of the other ways in which to try and divert resources is getting multinational companies to pay their fair share of tax. As I mentioned before, multinational corporations pay less tax in a lot of cases than their workers pay, and they also tend to take all the profits out of the countries in the global south where they operate. So that's also another way in which we can make sure that resources remain within the south. And critically, a lot of campaigners have called on the need for new global tax tax rules under a UN global tax body. As we've seen, the current global economic system has evolved from a bygone era as the product of a colonial legacy. And so a lot of these rules that exist at the moment are, they're old, they're opaque, they don't make sense, they're very, very complex, and they tend to favor countries in the global north. So if there was a system by which we could have a new UN global tax body at which developing countries would have a seat at the table and help to develop those tax decisions, that would be a way, an equitable way to try and make sure that resources remain in the South and don't go to the North. And finally, I want to talk about this question around debt very, very quickly. So, and it's the question of or campaigners specifically from the South, global South, have talked about debt justice and not just debt relief. So as we are seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic, the pandemic is causing the existing global debt crisis that we already had to be intensified, and we're seeing the IMF provide emergency loans and not grants to a lot of countries in the global South. And so this is just simply exacerbating a problem that was already there to begin with. And so what we're seeing with the loans that are being provided by the IMF and the World Bank is that they are countries are still being expected to prioritize repaying those debts instead of providing an adequate resolution to the pandemic. And again, these neoliberal economic policies that continue to drive decision-making. So just by way of a really, really short plug, we at Gaddon have a joint paper with the Bretton Woods Project, who many of you will be familiar with, called May Contain Austerity, which looks at how the international response to COVID-19 threatens a return to austerity, as well as undermines women's rights. So I'm just going to pop that link in the chat box if you want to have a brief read. It's only a short paper, but just for you to be able to have a look at some of the key problems that we're seeing come up from this emergency financing with the IMF. So some Southern debt justice campaigns have also been calling for the unconditional cancellation of all public external debt payments. So that's made by all lenders, whether that be bilateral, multilateral, private lenders. And this has to be done for a minimum of at least 4 years. So you cancel any new loans or any debt, that's been provided currently, especially as a way to try and respond to the pandemic. And finally, it's a lot of Southern debt justice campaigners and advocates have been calling for this question of reparations. And we won't get into what reparations is in its entirety here, but we know that from the way that our current economies are designed, which hugely benefited European powers, countries in the global North, at the expense of Black, Indigenous people of color and across the global South. The question of reparations is for those rich countries in the global North to pay what they owe to developing countries for all the huge amounts of unpaid labor, resources that were pillaged, etc. And if that was to actually happen, you would see that almost the complete devastation of countries in the global North, because the amount of money goes into the absolute trillions. So that is one of the ways in which global South campaigners, especially debt justice campaigners, have advocated for the retention of resources in the South. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation, which means that we can now move into the next part of the session, which is breakout groups. So hopefully from the discussion that we've had, or I've had with you, you've been able to get a good understanding, or at least an introductory understanding about what we mean by macro level economics, why it's a women's rights issue, who makes decisions about our global economy, how it works, where those decisions are made, how those decisions are made, but also how feminist macro level economics can aid in the redistribution of resources from the global North to the global South. So in the breakout groups, what will happen is that in the next minute or two, you will all be automatically placed into a breakout group. Once you get into those breakout groups, you will, if you can try and locate what breakout group number you've been assigned, you can typically find this right at the top of the top bar of your Zoom. And this will correspond with a Jamboard page that we are asking you to fill in. And I'll get to explaining what we mean by Jamboard if you've never used it, but it's basically a virtual whiteboard or a flip chart. So once you get into your breakout groups, if it would be really helpful for each of you to identify a facilitator, somebody who can just chair the discussion in your breakout group, and also just one rapporteur who will be able to report back some of the discussions from your group. So you will have a total of about 35 minutes in your groups to answer two key questions, and those questions will be put in the Jamboard. So don't worry, everything I'm telling you now, you don't need to retain. It will be in the Jamboard, all the instructions. And so in the Jamboard, there are instructions on how to use Post-it notes almost to write down your responses and your answers. And then at the end of the breakout group, we're going to ask, I'll pick on some of the facilitators to give us some of their readouts from the breakout group, some of the answers to the questions. And the key questions that we have for you today is firstly, to share some of your real life experiences of how the design of your national economy, where you live at the moment, works against women. So think about issues like unpaid care, underfunded public services, lack of recourse to social protections, just how that has played out in a real life sense for you. But also the second question that we'd like you to think about is, what role do you, other feminists and other women's rights organizations have in shifting economic decision-making? So those are the two questions that we have for you. And just to give you a snapshot, this is what your breakout group will look like, or your Jamboard will look like, for you to be able to populate and put your answers in. But I'm now going to put the link to the Jamboard in the chat box, so bear with me a second. So how many are we? Okay, so I think actually if we have 3 breakout groups, I think that will be enough for the people that are on the call now. So I hope that's okay, Rachel. So I'm going to put the link to the chat box now. Bear with me a second. So you're likely to be in breakout group 1, 2, or 3. Okay, chat box. Sorry, it's just, let me put it in, find the chat box. Here it is. Okay. So if you can access the Jamboard through that link. And as I mentioned, all the instructions on how to use Jamboard, as well as the identifying a facilitator and a rapporteur, etc. All the instructions are in that Jamboard as well, just in case you haven't been able to retain everything. So you're going to go into the breakout groups, and we'll see you back here in about 35 minutes, if we can, for the breakout groups, Rachel, if possible, just so that we come back in time for a discussion. So I'll leave it at that. So I'll pop into some of the breakout group discussions as well, just to hear some of the discussions if possible. Okay, I think we're all now back in the room. So I managed to pop into some of the discussions that were being had, some really, really, really amazing discussions, rich conversations, and fascinating again, especially for me, about how wherever you are in the world, the oppression might play out differently, slightly differently based on your cultural context, but the systems are still exactly the same, and the same issues continue to pop up repeatedly. So given the few minutes that we have left, what I wanted to do, we've got 3 breakout groups. Would one person from each breakout room, perhaps the facilitator, or if there was a rapporteur, a note taker, who can give us maybe 2 really top line takeaways from the discussion that you had, either on both the questions or just one particular area, maybe just to share some of the recurring themes that you found coming up in the conversations over and over again based on the discussions that you were having. So I want to start off with group 1, breakout group 1. Is there anybody who would be able to kind of feedback in just 1 minute the nature of your discussion?
Sure, Sophie, I'm happy to do it. So Connie helped to sort of facilitate the session, and we took some notes. But basically, very broadly, there was a sense that there's an overrepresentation of women doing the work of care, as you shared, and the economy is organized in a manner that continues to undervalue that care, and there isn't adequate childcare or other facilities. Access to public services depend on immigration status, and that comes down particularly hard on certain communities of women, and also it impacts irregular care workers or irregular workers in general, as well as migrant workers. And there was a very interesting contribution from Italy on how there's a campaign for self-determination income, so that women who are facing gender-based violence are not further marginalized by their conditions in terms of being able to be active in various spheres. Then moving on to sort of what can we as feminists do, there was a great consensus that we need to visibilize some of these issues because people don't even see these as problems in our societies. But even when you do visibilize it, one of the contributions made by Hume was that people don't want feminists like us in the room at the decision-making table. So how do you push past those barriers? And our colleague, Vivian from South Africa was sharing how even though there is engagement with the legislature, it isn't getting anywhere. So we sort of stuck at that and sort of also highlighted the need, therefore, for transnational solidarity and movements that can collectively push for the revolution that we're waiting for. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
Sounds like an absolutely fascinating discussion, Pooja. Thank you so much for brilliantly capturing that. Brilliant, thank you. So group 2, who would like to report back?
Hello there, I can do so.
Sure, go ahead, Siobhan.
We may have somebody else talking.
Oh, okay, I think, yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Okay. So firstly, it was great to meet lots of activists from all over the world and have a really interesting discussion. I think the two top lines are that women who are engaging in unpaid work within Indigenous communities often have, and this was across a lot of different contexts. We saw having a lack of access to public health services, and really importantly, women are not involved in making decisions at any level, from potentially from local government to national government to international institutions. And connected to that was the use of microfinance loans that are often used to try and target women as part of national strategic plans to either in response to COVID or in general to try and give women access to the economy, but often results in women who are very vulnerable. Some people were saying they meet lots of women who have recently divorced or left an abusive partner, and they end up in debt. So it further exacerbates the situation that they were in. And then we discussed the roles, and a lot of us agreed that we really need to produce research about the issues to ensure our place on the table and getting women that are affected by these decisions, these macroeconomic decisions, into the process.
Perfect, thanks. Thank you so much, Siobhan. Yes, I dropped into that session as well, and I think you captured a lot of those points brilliantly. Thank you. And last point, but by no means least, group 3.
Hi there, by accident. So we had Yolanda, Nancy, Marissa, Agatha, Tihani, ABCD, and Neki, and Priyanka, and a couple of people drop in and out. Since some of the things already mentioned in other groups, I think we'll mention that we talked about military spending, and Agatha gave an example in the Philippines where they've increased their budget by 3,000% for a national task force to end local armed communists. And others in the group as well talked about how their countries have such large spending on military. And Marissa, who's from the Caribbean, and myself from Malaysia, that for us is very different. We don't really have that. And not to put Yolanda on the spot, if she's still here, she was sharing about debt audits that they did in Spain. So I thought that was really interesting because we don't tend to do that too much. Well, actually, I've never heard of doing debt audits, but she was talking about the participation and promoting citizen participated debt auditing. And I really like that idea. And I would like to see us do that here. So that was very, very helpful for me. And we also talked about women's participation in the political sphere and how it should come also from very grassroots sense, like through supporting community-based organizations that are women-run and building up to that, and not to be token political people in the political sphere, you know, like just to hit a quota, all right, you get this 30% women, but they're not really part of that grassroots or really active and more just figureheads. That's about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Harjinder. And I think that, again, so brilliantly captures the breadth of the discussions that were had in the groups. And it's so interesting about how the specific contexts in which, you know, you all find yourselves, the ways in which some of these issues play out. So I'm really, really grateful for all of you for sharing that. So that brings us to the end of today's session. I want to thank absolutely all of you for contributing so actively to the conversation, as well as to everybody at the Global South Women's Forum Organizing Committee who's been really amazing and instrumental in setting up the space for this discussion today. So I will certainly share the PowerPoint presentation as well as the link to the Jamboard with the organizers so that it can be made more publicly available. And certainly I hope that, you know, I'll be able to touch base with some of you in some of the other sessions that are planned for this week. So thank you so much again, everybody. And that's it from me. Take care.
You're welcome, Sophie, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.